Hello, hello, hello. I am so excited to be back doing Black Cambridge and talking about COVID-19. I know it's been a little while, but Councilor Simmons and I are really excited to be back today, recording and talking about some of the challenges and the hopes that's associated with vaccines now being available for young people in our community. So we're going to have a robust conversation today. But before we get started, I'm going to hand it over to my esteemed co-host, re-elected Councilor Denise Simmons. Denise, welcome back. Are you excited to be doing Black Cambridge again?
I am very excited to be back. I'm excited to be talking to folks about these important and critical issues. I'm glad to be back with you, even if you're not going to be going forward in elected office. Just knowing that you're going to stay and remain in the fray is really important to me and to a number of other people. So thank you for, being my partner in what I call good trouble. I also want to just thank, shout out to Maritza Grooms and the CCTV folks. It's been a long time. COVID has been very hard on all of us.
Yes,
It's made it so that we have to find ways to engage in different ways. And through CCTV, we've had this opportunity to engage in the community in a way that we've not always been able to, but have been able to have a consistent, I'm going to call it a communication lifeline.
Yes.
To the community at large, particularly Black people. I didn't say people of color, I'm saying Black people, because my colleague and co-host, school committee woman Bowman, we've always been very intentional about it being the voices of Black people. So thank you, CCTV and Maritza. I want to welcome as well Dr. Holmes, Dr. Callahan, and Nuriel Vera-Degraff for joining us this morning at I shouldn't say this morning, today, in this important conversation. As 2020 started to wind down and we are approaching, 2 years of COVID-19 era, we really have experienced some turbulent and frightening times. Many of us have lost someone close to us due to these awful and terrifying illness. All of us know someone that has maybe gotten sick or have had to negotiate it or have their lives upended into just so many different ways. And certainly something that every single one of us have in common during this pandemic has been wanting to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. And that is paramount. And I think part of this conversation really is going to be is how do we keep folks safe, healthy, and protected from the very, very worst of this COVID-19 virus. I want to say just about a year ago, the first vaccines were just starting to come online, and they offered the first glimmers of hope that this pandemic might be contained. And as the start of the year, the vaccines became widely available for almost all adults across the country. But it was not until very recently that the vaccines were approved for the safe use in our children.
Yeah.
And with that approval, the question arose to how to ensure as many children as possible could get a jab in the arm and that critical protection. The school committees across the Commonwealth and School Committee Bowman will talk a little bit about that, have been grappling with this. And we've seen some pretty, contentious meetings on local news about should I and should I not. So I know that Manikka is going to be able to share more about what our Cambridge School Committee is going to be doing, has done, and will continue to do, and how they arrived at the decision to have a mandated vaccination. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion today as we all weigh in on why mandates are the right decision for keeping our children safe. So Manikka, I'm going to turn it back to you. Take us away.
Yes, so we have a really dynamic panel. I'm really excited to have them here today. So allow me to just introduce them. We have Dr. Jeanette Callahan, who is a deeply respected pediatrician here in the Cambridge community. She is associated with the Cambridge Health Alliance. Welcome, Dr. Callahan. We have Dr. Michelle Holmes, also here in our community. She is an epidemiologist that is associated with the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And we have my colleague for at least the next, 40 days, Doctor. I mean, I called you Doctor. I'm speaking your future. Member DeGrasse. We have member Nuriel Vera-Degraff, who serves with me as a student member to the Cambridge School Committee. And let me just say, he has been fully present throughout all of our meetings and all of these really tough, difficult conversations we've been having around mandates and whether or not to open schools. He's been on the front lines of those conversations. So I have so much respect for him as a colleague, and I'm so elated to have him here today. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
So we're going to get right to it. So I want to start with Dr. Holmes. Dr. Holmes, I want you to give us this big picture perspective and let people know about, tell us about the process by which a clinical trial moves forward, and how were young people age 5 to 12 a part of that process that led to the approval of these vaccines for that cohort of individuals?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to join this very distinguished group and have a chance to speak to you today. So the vaccine process for children is really very similar to that followed by the adults, with the exception that it takes a bit longer because of the need to adjust the dose for smaller bodies. So what happens is a number of children are gotten together. Some of them are given vaccine, some of them are given placebo. They don't know, no one knows who gets what. Then we wait and see how many kids get COVID. And then we look statistically to see if the kids that got the real vaccine got less COVID. Even if, and that would mean that it's effective. Even after we figure out if it's effective at preventing COVID, we still have to wait a couple of months, usually about 2 months, to see if there were any side effects from the vaccine before determining that it's both effective and safe. Then the information is presented to panels of scientists and doctors at the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. If they determine that the benefits are greater than the downsides, then the vaccine is approved. So what happened in the case of the child vaccine is that there were over 2,000 kids ages 5 to 11 who were enrolled. And what we learned is that they had a very similar antibody response as older people. The vaccine presented 90% of the infections, and there were 0 serious side effects. And so I think that's a really spectacular result. And so it was approved.
That's wonderful. We live during this time where, people leverage a lot of different outlets to give them information. So I think it's really important as we continue to have this conversation, hearing about the process from someone who understands it, who's a professional in the field, I think is really important. So Dr. Callahan, given the trajectory of where we are, the trial period, the approval process, even though it's an emergency authorization, right? How should parents be thinking about the vaccine for their children? And what are we doing across the Commonwealth to open up opportunities for vaccination for kids 5 to 12, but even kids up to 18?
The thing about vaccinations, so first of all, thank you so much for having me back on this amazing program. The thing about vaccines and parents is that it's sort of part of their life for the first, 16 years. Every time the children come to the clinic, they are expecting a vaccine. And so the concept of a vaccine is certainly not new. What is intriguing about the COVID vaccine is how many questions are being asked about it that I've yet to be asked about the other vaccines, the many, many vaccines starting at age 6 months. And I think that it shows the power of social media. It just really does show how much control the social media has on people's mentality and thoughts and beliefs about just about everything. And so when parents are coming in and asking, as pediatricians, of course, we're prepared to answer the questions about vaccines, but we are inundated with questions. I have had several televisits that specifically want to talk about the COVID vaccine and its safety and its efficacy. One thing I want us to emphasize is that there were no shortcuts in the production of this COVID vaccine. It went through all of the necessary steps to assure its safety. As Dr. Holmes has talked about, there's a cohort of children that were really whose parents were a blessing to all of us to allow their children to be a part of that cohort. And I know several families who allowed their children to be part of that. And they went through every step. The difference, the speed, was really due to the collaborative effort of all of the organizations that usually work in silos. And so we found the power of the social media, but we also found the power of collaboration and the power of money going towards money from the state, the government going towards a single effort. And so we are really delighted, and I'm delighted to be able to tell parents that finally children between 5 and 11 can receive the vaccine. So the kinds of questions I'm getting are obviously around side effects. And so I'm delighted to tell folks that 0 of that cohort had developed any major side effects. Now, there are side effects and then there are adverse effects. And I think that we all know that if we get an injection, we're going to have a sore arm. We're going to probably get a fever. We're probably going to feel achy. Our muscles are going to feel achy. And those are all kinds of things that I talk to parents about that are very, very not really unique to the COVID vaccine. And the adverse effects are ones that we discuss about every vaccine: anaphylaxis, difficulty, severe allergic reactions, myocarditis, and perhaps we'll come back to that, and pericarditis. Some things that that can happen really with any type of a vaccine, not just COVID. For 5 to 11-year-olds, what's interesting about them is that they have a robust, what we call immunogenicity. So the immune response is excellent. And the lower dose that we are giving kids, because they're getting only 1/3 the dose of an adult, that's 10 micrograms versus 30, is because their bodies respond so well. We want to avoid what's called the reactogenicity, which is just all the bad side effects and all the aches and the pains and the fevers. We want to avoid that. So fortunately, we don't have to give a truckload of vaccine to produce a very, very robust immune response. So in terms of the question about what, and that's only a handful of the questions I get quite a few others. Maybe we'll get back to those. But in answer to what Massachusetts is doing, first of all, there's actually an approach that the entire nation is trying to do. It's sort of four tiers of how to roll out this vaccine. And one is by having what's called vaccine for children providers, which are people who are trained to give the vaccine. We see those in pop-up clinics and various nurses and other providers that can provide the vaccine. We have obviously the primary care sites, the pediatricians and family medicine folks and the med-peds folks that see children on a regular basis. We also have pharmacies that are involved. As we know, Walgreens and CVS have jumped in to help Rite Aid, even Walmart and some of these other locales that are allowing vaccine sites to pop up there. And then last but not least, we have school-based vaccines. And actually the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth, is utilizing all of the above. The preference in polls for parents is that they want to go to their doctor. They want to be there. They want to hold their child's hand, and they want to sit with them for those 15 minutes after to make sure that there are no side effects that are concerning. And so there are a number of ways that folks can get the vaccine now, which is amazing. And there's also online. There's a way that you can actually go on to Find a Vax site that the Commonwealth has provided. And I took the liberty of trying it myself, and it gave me 25 locations near my zip code that I could take my 5 to 11-year-old child if I had one. I don't.
Well, I do. I have two of them.
I have passed that stage of life delightfully.
Yeah, the struggle's been real caring for small children during COVID. Yes.
It's been real.
I'll take prayers. But it's interesting. I want to go back to something that you said, Dr. Callahan, that I think is really important for this conversation, that I've had a lot of conversations with my significant other about. I would say for the past like multiple decades, we've never lived through a pandemic at all. And so we take for granted all of those shots that our kids, or that we've all gotten as children.
That's right.
We've taken it for granted, and we don't have a connection to why it's important. We just trust that, okay, we do it. And so now, fast forward to today, we're living through an experience that none of us have had to in our lifetimes in the way that our foremothers and forefathers have. And it's really interesting how we've interacted with science as a result of that, despite the fact that we've benefited from it because of the commitment, because society has just said yes, and disease have remained pretty low up until this point. And so it's interesting. I think it's another reason why Denise and I are really committed to these types of shows, so people can just, their collective historical, or I like to say ancestral memory of the things that our foremothers and fathers have done before us to position us to be able to have the life that we have. And so we have an obligation to do that in this moment, moving forward. And so, when we think about, the vaccine, and in the context of the past, Sankofa, I like to say, in order to move forward, you have to look back. As an African proverb, it's not mine. But, I want to hear from Dr. Holmes and yourself, and Member DeGrasse jump in too. Like, why is it important for children that are smaller, that does not have the same impact? It's still a risk, of course, to children, but it's a different risk than for adults and for older teenagers. But why is it still important for these cohorts of kids to still have the vaccine? So maybe we could jump to Dr. Holmes, and Dr. Callahan, please jump in after that.
Yes, I think that's a really important question, because it is true that on average, children have milder cases of COVID than older folks do. However, we have to remember that thousands of children have still been hospitalized, and it's surprisingly difficult to get these statistics, but I think about 600 have died. And I looked that up, and that's roughly equivalent to the number of children who died of cancer in the past year. Now, if you ask people, I have a shot that's going to prevent your child from dying from cancer, I think folk would line up for that. So, it seems important to prevent the deaths of, even small, nationwide, what is small numbers of children from COVID. And the other thing is children can get long-term symptoms from it, long haul COVID. So we want to prevent that as well. Another thing I think folks don't appreciate is that of those children that died and were hospitalized, they were 50% more likely to be Black kids or brown kids. And so this is an equity issue. And finally, we take these children that have mild cases, you may not even know they have it, and they can come home and they can infect their vulnerable family members and community members who maybe can't get vaccinated. Their 2-year-old sibling who can't yet get vaccinated, or their immunocompromised relative or elderly relative. So vaccinating our children is really a family and community issue, as well as individual benefit for that child.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Holmes. That's absolutely true. And I think for a long time into this pandemic, we had this notion that that COVID sort of had an agenda to just target certain people. That COVID came into the world with a hit list, and it didn't include children, and it only included the elderly. And we quickly learned that that was not the case. I mean, there were infants born, not many, but thankfully not many born with COVID, and most of the transmission was at the actual delivery, not transplacentally. But we saw newborns, neonates with COVID. We saw the elderly with COVID. We saw every age group in between. And yes, the effects of COVID on the youthful immune system what is less. The actual symptoms are less, but the ability for a young child to transmit the infection, we also thought was less, and that's not true. It can absolutely be the source of infection. And for the longest time, the hot spots were family gatherings, passing it along one to another. And the other thing that we have to realize is that, what we're trying to do is reduce viral load across the nation, across the world. Unfortunately, we've done a terrible job in terms of our global response. Mm-hmm. But reducing the viral load is something that an immunization can do. And the more folks that we immunize, the greater the likelihood that we would reach not herd immunity. I think we've given up on that. We didn't act fast enough for that, but we can reduce the viral load. And I always think of the viral load as like, driving through a misty, if you're driving across the state. I went to Vermont and there was fog and I could barely see. And I think about is that a particular viral load versus a couple of drops of rain that might hit you or not on a very clear day. And we want a nice clear day. We want to reduce the viral load. And young people, carry the infection. They are the source. As a pediatrician, we are at extreme risk because that was the population not vaccinated for a long time. And they were the ones that came with colds and runny nose, and many of them did have COVID. Mm-hmm. So I'm delighted that there is a vaccine. We also should know that the reduced amount of vaccine, some parents are a little bit concerned about that. Because they thinking that their child is getting a little less of a protection, but they're actually not. And it is an age-based dose. And so I've gotten a lot of questions about whether or not only is it safe for young people, but if my child is 11 and going to turn 12 in 2 weeks, should I just wait? And I'm like, no, you need the vaccine yesterday. Please don't wait. And since it's age-based, if you got your first dose at the lower 1/3 dosing, if you're 12 for that second dose, you get the 12-year-old dose, the adult dose, because it is not weight-based. Vaccines have never been weight-based. They are age-based. And they change because of the development of the immune system. And that's why we can say it's more age-based. That's why 6-month-olds can get the flu and not 2-month-olds with the flu vaccine. Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. Get the flu vaccine. So it's because of the development of the immune system. There's certain points where giving a vaccine is not going to produce the kind of immunogenicity that we need.
Remember DeGraff, in the conversations that we've heard from, if I can jump right in, from Dr. Holmes and Dr. Callahan, both times they've talked about youth. And this conversation is really about youth and immunizing, young people. Remember, Vera-Degraff, you have been a leader at the school committee level, at the high school, around the conversation around the testing and the immunization. And I'm just interested from a grandparent of a person. Yes, I claim it, I name it, and I'm glad to be it, because yes. I don't have to do what you're doing, Sister Bowman. But I know you've been engaging your peers in the importance of the vaccination. And so I want to pose 2 questions that I would like you to just think about, knowing that there's no right or wrong answer, which is, how have those conversations been? And then if we all can kind of think about what I call the elephant in the room, is we know that the communities of color have been hardest hit and the slowest to get there. And so if we can talk about that, looking through your eyes, member Vera-Degraff, how has that conversation been? You know, how much is I ain't gonna do it because I don't need to do it, or I'm afraid to do it, or it came from Mars. I mean, I'm just interested in knowing on from your perspective, from your line of sight, what that conversation has been, what might the impediments be, and what are just young people thinking in general. So I really like to hear from you on that.
Thank you. Thank you for the great question. Thank you both, Vice Chair Bowman and Councilor Simmons, for having me. It's a pleasure. Something really quickly I'd like to go back, though, before I answer this question, is about what Dr. Holmes and Dr. Callahan mentioned about having kids who are not symptomatic, not showing great symptoms, but still spreading the vaccine. This is something that around my circles as a teenager, there's many students, not just at CRLS, but among the country in general, who on social media are kind of propagating this notion that if you don't have COVID, if you don't have symptoms, you can't spread it. And then even if you get it, if you're a teenager or you're a young kid, if you're 12, 13, 14, you're not going to be that affected by it. And I think that kind of talks to the point that Dr. Callahan mentioned about how social media is such a big influencer of people's opinions, because on TikTok, on Instagram, on Snapchat, all these platforms that so many students within the 12 to 18 range are using, there's all these ideas, like this big idea that, oh, I don't need to get the vaccine because if I get it, worst case, I might have a cold for a little bit, but it's not going to be that bad. Or I don't need to get the vaccine because if I get it, it's just going to go away after a while because I'm young and I'm strong and whatever, right? So I think that's just a brief point that I want to mention that is kind of dangerous because it ties to all this misinformation that's really prevalent in especially the younger kids and younger students. And I do think that kind of connects to your first question, Councilor Simmons, about what students are thinking, what the conversations have been like. I find it hard, or it's hard to picture any student within CPS or within CRLS or any of the upper schools really not wanting to get the vaccine because they don't care about their community. That's not the issue, right? And so when we have these conversations, and for me, it's mostly at the high school level, what it comes down to usually is information. It's a lack of information and it's a lack of clear information. And so I think, again, what Dr. Callahan has been kind of bringing to the top is that there needs to be more clarity and more accessibility in terms of where the science is and what the data is saying. And I think the thing that me and my peers are working on as part of student government on the school committee is really doing the best we can to amplify student voices and to tell other students that, look, the vaccine has been tested, it's been approved by the FDA, as Dr. Holmes so beautifully explained, and really just making sure they understand all the information that's there and are not making their decision based on hearsay, based on something they got from someone on TikTok or someone on Snapchat or their friend who heard this from someone else, And so I think it really just comes back to clarity of information, and it's a long struggle. And for the past couple of months, it's been a really big focus of student leaders at CRLS, but I think we're making progress. And actually recently, a couple of weeks ago, with the coordination with the Cambridge Media Arts Studio, or the CRLS Media Arts Studio, we produced a video that had student leaders from throughout the school. We had members from the BSU, from the Next Club, from different sports activities, all of which will be affected by the mandate, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure. But leaders from these different groups within the school came together and made a video about why it's important to get vaccinated and why they got vaccinated and why other students should get vaccinated. And I don't have the latest data yet in terms of district-wide vaccinations, but I'm sure this video made a positive impact in terms of getting more people aware. And so I think it's simple things like that coming from other students that will slowly increase the awareness and clarity of information coming to teenagers in high school and in upper schools.
I'm very excited to hear that you're doing that kind of work, because when we talk about communication, and more people than not get their information from social media, not even the news, but social media. And we know it can be skewed in such a way. Sometimes it boggles my mind that you want what I call fact check, instead of separate what's real and what's not. For people that are older, like myself, they think about the Tuskegee, in fact, to hear one more time, I'm gonna lose my mind. The Tuskegee experiment and what happened to Henrietta Glatz, and we can go on and on. So that sort of inbred fear, that's what doesn't motivate older folks, I've found. And then this misinformation that is so amply provided coming from social media that is influencing young people. I think one key point that we certainly need to make, kind of drill down on, and I know Sister Bowman and I, my co-host Bowman and I, started this program around, was about information. How do we make sure we get the right information to people? So I'm really pleased to hear that you're doing those sort of peer conversations, because if they're not listening necessarily to older people, listening to one another, but based on information that is factual. So I'm really pleased to hear that's going on.
So, Councilor Simmons, I think I heard a mandate there that we need to get on, what's the platforms, TikTok?
Snapchat, Instagram.
Yeah, all the platforms. We need to bring Black Cambridge to those platforms. But I think what
You student member to do that, because I can't.
It's interesting one thing that I've been grappling with this whole conversation with students, encouraging them and motivating them to get vaccinated, in the context of our school districts, something that hasn't been lost on me that I would love for all of us to kind of just process through with each other is that children are connected to a family unit, right? And so we have all of these campaigns and we have the best of efforts happening. However, sometimes it can create a tension, quite frankly. If there is a student that is getting one set of information, and then there's maybe some reluctancy in a family household unit. So I'm just kind of curious, how are some of those conversations being handled? Because, we want to encourage youth vaccination, and we also don't want to create intense moments in households. So I think it's like engaging on all fronts, particularly from my lens as the vice chair of the school committee. But I'm very curious, Dr. Callahan, you interact with parents and kids. So how have those conversations been going when there maybe has been eagerness from a kid, but not a parent? How do you bridge those conversations?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. It's real, and it happens just about every day. I actually find that most youth want the vaccine. So I'm always floored by how much, even though there's a lot of miseducation out there, most of the kids, they want it. This is just another vaccine for them, and they really do want it. The parents that are hesitant, it's very hard to actually have the conversation as a unit, because sometimes the youth is not really that honest about wanting it, because there is a lot of tension at home. And so what I often do is I often have the conversation as a group, but then give some time to just have the parent talk to me as well and say, what are your real fears? What are you really concerned about? And then have the youth have a separate conversation with me as well. But the thing I do emphasize is that we all have to come to a conclusion together as to what's best for you. I can tell you as your physician that I can give you my recommendation, and I even add the word strong in front of the word recommendation. But no matter what I say to you in this office, they're recommendations. And recommendations are either taken or they're not. And I think that pulling myself out of like trying to convince or trying to persuade, because then it's like, do you persuade the parent, do you persuade the kid? And then you find yourself taking sides. And so I try to keep really right in the middle with the science, with addressing whatever questions come up, and encouraging the young person to actually speak to their parents about what it is that they want. And for the parents to be brave enough to be honest about what it is that is making them hesitant. A lot of times the parents will fall back to, well, I just want to wait. And then I say, well, that's okay, you want to wait, but you're going to need to target what it is you're waiting for. That's where you take that next step to really appreciate and respect your adolescent who is trying to look at what it is you're waiting for and have a conversation about what that is. I had one parent, which I was amazed, I actually wished I could video it, was having a conversation with their 13-year-old about the COVID vaccine. And she started talking about, well, my concerns about vaccines in general. And that, for a long time, I didn't do your vaccines when you were a child. She was going on about that. And she goes, but I understand that this is your body and that there's body autonomy and this is your decision. And I'd like to make this decision together. And I just sat and watched them. He talked about his concerns. And then I said, would you like me to step out? They said, no, we'd like you to hear this. And then in the end, he wanted the vaccine. He got, and so it was just a beautiful thing to watch. and the kind of negotiation that we want to see parents have about all kinds of issues. We can't say anymore, I do it because I said so. That is just not going to work.
Member DeGrasse, I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, how, when you are in conversation with your peers and those dynamics coming up from the household, like how are you engaging your peers with those very complicated dynamics?
Yeah, so to answer that, I'll first say that it's important to know there's a big difference between a person in high school, a person in upper school, and a person in elementary school, a kid in all those grades. And so I think we can talk about this later as well, but as the vaccination is available for 5 to 11 now, I think there's going to be a whole other conversation of how we engage parents at that level, and how there's a difference in autonomy and information and kind of the drive for self-advocacy that you see in these different ages. But in terms of at the high school level, I think it's tough because I know at least one anecdotal story, and I'm sure there's many more, of students who were participating in a fall sport and want to do a winter sport, and they want to get vaccinated because of this, because of the mandate. But then their parent, for various reasons, is against that. And that creates, as you said, Professor Bill, this tension between the parent who thinks they know or they know what's best for their child, but then the child who wants something completely different for maybe a different reason. And so in these situations, it's often really hard to know what to do. And I think the best thing that any student can do is just have information, have the science, and have the data, and say, you know, when they have these conversations with their parents, just emphasize why they want to get vaccinated and really the safety of it all. And I think when we've been engaging on the student government level and kind of the school level on the whole, and even in the video, we've kind of emphasizing that it's all about the science, all about the data, and all about the safety. But I think something else that's kind of related to that is when we get into elementary school, there's this really big difference, right? In high school, many teachers or many teenagers come back home with information. They get information from the school or from teachers, from administrators, and then they come home and say, hey mom, hey dad, here's what I got in school today. I learned this about a vaccine, or I learned this about XYZ. But when they're in the younger grades, if they're in third grade or second grade, it's a really different dynamic between the parent and the student, is what I believe. You have the parent usually giving information to the student, and so it becomes a whole different conversation. So I'm curious, I guess this would be for Dr. Callahan, how can we deal with that difference, and how can we more target parents who have younger students in the grades who don't have that much information coming home, and it's mostly focused on the parent? Because it was a really beautiful illustration of that 13-year-old and their parent, but it would be a completely different situation if you have a 6-year-old and their parent having that level of maturity. It's probably going to be hard to have that conversation in the same way. So I'm curious, how do you deal with that as well?
Yeah, it's very different. And in the end, the parent rules. Okay, in the end, it is their decision. Most parents that I really work with, want what's best for their child, and you just keep talking about how this is going to benefit their child. It is a constant, ongoing conversation. I have parents that have dug their heels in. They have just dug their heels in, and it's then I begin to just talk about, well, let's keep them safe in other ways. Let's keep the mask on. Let's, physically distance. Drive your child to school instead of letting them take the bus. I mean, there's other things that you can talk about. They don't replace the vaccine. And I'm sure I make sure that to make that clear. You generally don't have these younger kids arguing with their parents about the vaccine. A lot of times children will emulate the feelings that their parents have. So the fear and concerns that the parents relay within the household, the kids absorb that and generally sort of bring that into the conversation, which is very different in that developmental age group. And so it's important for me, at least this is my opinion, it's important for me to hold the parents during that time, to leave space for them to feel what they feel and to answer questions that they have, and not to shame them and not to blame them and not to, make them feel that they don't love their child if they don't do this, because that really does work against what we all want for families and to empower families and families of color. Yes, in particular, I have to admit, the majority of the families that are still digging their heels in are families of color, and they don't have to go back to Tuskegee to be concerned about the disparities of health and the ways in which we don't really treat people with respect. We don't have to go back that far in history. It is still happening now. And so I think it's really just holding that space. And that's often what they don't have. And I've had parents call back a couple months later and say, okay, I'm ready. So it does work, but it is a very, very different dynamic. I have a couple precocious 7-year-olds that say, I don't know what's wrong with my parents. I want the vaccine. but usually they really do hold the same opinion as their parents.
And Dr. Callahan, you make an excellent point. Is oftentimes kids take on the viewpoints of their parents, except those precocious middle graders. I have a precocious 8-year-old, so I understand that, granddaughter, and I understand that very well. I wonder, what do we do when we think about the Black and Brown community in particular? How do we do a better job of talking to those parents, those families, to bring them along? One of the conversations that Sister Bowman and I hope to have is the disparity in healthcare. And you're right, you don't have to go to Tuskegee, and Tuskegee doesn't mean much to you if you're not African American or Henrietta Glass for that matter. But the whole disparity in healthcare are real. And we're not on Instagram, I don't think, or Snapchat or Snapchat. I can't even say them all, or TikTok. And even if we were, we wouldn't get to some of these parents.
Right.
And so, at some point, maybe not in this conversation, it would be good to talk about as a group, engaging all those voices as to how do we, I won't say do a better job, because I know we're working hard at it. How can we find ways to be more effective at getting to those parents? Because it's not only the vaccine, which is the purpose of our conversation, but it's healthcare in general. So
in general,
we appreciate your thoughts on that. And
I would be curious to hear from Dr. Holmes, particularly from like that public health perspective. And I know that you have done work not just locally, but globally, right? And I remember the last time you were on the program, you talked about some of the work that you were in conversation with your colleagues in South Africa. So you have this Pan-African perspective when it comes to this. I'm just kind of curious, what have been some conversations and approach from a community health perspective when it comes to Black and Brown people from a diaspora perspective, because we know our Black community is so diverse here, right? What have been some of those things that have worked to engage communities and families?
I have to remember to unmute. Yes. So I think the things that have worked have been trusted voices, having Black physicians and scientists bringing the message. I think it's also important to validate people's concerns. I mean, it's not crazy to think that, given the long, long history of mistreatment of our community by the medical profession, it's not crazy to be suspicious. So we have to validate that concern. At the same time, I think there are ways that we can reframe the concerns. So for instance, a couple of things I've been thinking of, I haven't actually used them. One is noting that Black people with COVID have gotten less treatment than white people with COVID. To me, that's an argument to get a vaccine. I got to prevent it, because if I get it and go to the hospital, I may not get treated as well. So just, reframing that as well. The other is just sort of Dr. Callahan and I were on a call a few days ago, reframing kind of the history. So I think there's this notion that, this vaccine was developed real quick, and this is some bogus stuff that pharma and Kendall Square, dreamt up is going to put on the people, right? Most people don't know that vaccination was brought to this country by African people, that, that's right. The notion of vaccination is actually thousands of years old, was practiced maybe first in China, practiced in Africa for hundreds of years. And the Europeans in this country didn't know about it. They know about it because they witnessed their enslaved people vaccinating each other. So just to me that, reframing some of the history, reframing some of the issues might be a way to, from trusted voices, validating concerns and ways to, just just change the message.
Thank you.
Really, really quickly, I just wanted to kind of emphasize that point of trusted voices. I didn't make this as clear before, but when we put together this vaccine PSA video, that's something we kept in mind very carefully. And so, especially when thinking about Black and brown voices within the school, we thought about that very critically and how can we amplify those voices in the video. And I think especially with teenagers, if they see someone who doesn't look like them, who they don't relate to, telling them, oh, you should get the vaccine because of XYZ, they're much likely to believe that or to listen to them or to be open to change their opinion, as compared to someone they trust, someone who's empowered them in the past, someone who they can relate to in more ways. And so I just want to really emphasize that point that Dr. Holmes made.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to a conversation regarding a decision that our school committee voted on at the recommendation of our superintendent, who is a Black woman, our interim superintendent, Dr. Victoria Greer. You know, the whole country, quite frankly, is moving to a place where mandates is now a part of the conversation. Full disclosure, I am such a mandate person. Remember DeGraff, maybe you remember this, but very early on, before people were even saying the M word, I was like, mandate, please. And I know that there are some pros and some cons to that, right? We're now at this point, November 22nd, actually tomorrow is the deadline that we as a school district put in place for kids that want to continue to participate in extracurricular activities, including clubs and sporting events. For those who are eligible for a vaccine, we have a mandate that they are required. This does not mean that they do not have access to public education. They still will be able to attend our schools. We're just leveraging the tools that we have to increase the vaccination rate within our schools, because we recognize in order for us to continue to have a safe environment, we have to increase the vaccination rates amongst our young people. So as we move into this space, right, what I'm hearing from this conversation is moving people along in a very loving way. It's the trusted voice. And there's this tension of now, because we're over 20 months into this. I judge it based on my child. I had a child right before the world fell apart, i.e. COVID hit. And so she's 20 months old right now. And that's how long we've been in this, right? So now that tug of war between how do you have those loving conversations and knowing that people that have positions of decision-making have to make these hard decisions to move us forward a little faster, to protect the public health of our communities. I'm just kind of curious as we walk through this tension, how should we be walking this fine balance between those two things as we move forward with the conversation of mandates, which we know have worked. It does encourage people to get vaccinated. So, Dr. Callahan, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, it's a tricky conversation. I have a lot of tricky conversation in my field. But life is tricky. It just is. There are people who have very, very, very deep rooted beliefs, systems where the vaccines for them are, it's just so deep. It's hard to imagine how to even get to it, to have a conversation around why people really dig their heels all the way in, and are willing to actually die for those beliefs. So those folks are there. They're a small number. They are not a large number of people that have that opinion, but they exist. And I've actually know a colleague where that was the case, and can no longer work in our department because of the mandate. So mandates are very effective. I had patients that actually say, I'm waiting until they tell me I have to. And so I'm like, okay, well, now we are telling you to have to. And so they're willing to do it if they're being told to do it. So mandates are very effective, pushing folks along if there's a concern about them taking, or parents taking the responsibility themselves. They have someone to sort of consign that fault to. Well, they made me do it. And that has its impact on the population. So I believe that they are necessary. They are certainly not the way that any of us want to have to go, to force anyone to do anything. We want folks to come to the conclusion that it's the best thing to do. But I certainly see it. And so negotiating that conversation is admitting that it's a hard thing to do, admitting that, letting people say how difficult it is and accepting that, and not sort of becoming dogmatic and just say, you got to do it. But there's that compassion that still walks along with the conversation of a mandate. So I am delighted for them. I am grateful for them. I am grateful that we are in a state where masks were mandated within schools, that there were some things that were taken out of the hands of our parents to have to decide for the betterment of the community. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think that the mandate, along with the mandates, come a lot more questions about safety and about how to keep and what to do to prepare their kids, because they know that it's going to come. They're not going to tell their kids they can't play basketball. They just aren't going to go there. Many parents will not go there. They'll do what they have to for their kids to do the kinds of sports activities in particular that they want to do. But one thing I want to mention is that I encourage parents to use what's called V-Safe. It's something you can sign up for. It's something you download, where once you get the vaccine, you are actually, someone touches base with you and you can write any side effects that may have come up that you think may or may not be related to the vaccine. And you can actually upload and enroll yourself in that. That actually helps people know that somebody's looking after them after they've done something that they felt they had to do. And I'm delighted that the state offers that. And then just really seeing that, it took many, many years to eradicate polio, right? Many, many years of vaccinating and with mandates that were necessary even in that. And so it does get us to the point that we can get closer to a normal way of living.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Holmes, you want to talk a little bit about idea of mandates?
Yeah. So first I want to acknowledge that all the persuading we tried, the lotteries for scholarships and money and all that, they didn't work. Okay, we tried them. They don't work. And also, again, I'm all about reframing, thinking about how we approach other health or public health issues in our community. You may have a right to smoke. You don't have a right to blow smoke on me in a restaurant or in a public place. You can smoke in your own home. You don't have a right to drive your car 100 miles an hour up Mass Ave because you could injure me, okay? I believe people have a right not to take a vaccine. I also believe we have a right to restrict them from, public places because they can harm other people. People's rights are constrained when they start to hurt other people. And I think not being vaccinated hurts other people. So, you don't have to be vaccinated, and you also don't have to play basketball, and you don't have to be in certain workplaces. So that's the way I think about it. And if we look around, we do this all the time with our laws, right? We restrict people's activities all the time. So that's where I look at it.
And to our members of the school committee, Ms. Bowman and Mr. Vera-Degraff, I can't see your name because I took my glasses. Degraff, I mean, you're in this position of being decision makers. How's that been for each of you from a student representative perspective and also as a member of the school committee in a leadership position, having to negotiate the conversations about, well, I don't want to do this because I don't have to, or it's against my religious persuasion or health considerations, or it doesn't make sense to me. How has that been for each of you?
Yeah, Member DeGraff, do you want to go first?
I'll let you go first, Sure, Bowman. I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well,
give his answer, but go ahead.
I often tell people, people don't pay enough attention to school committees in general, right? Like, it is such an important elected body, but for the most part, it doesn't get the same amount of attention as a city council election does. And, Councilor Simmons, you've had the pleasure of serving on both, and so you know the value of both. What I can say is that in the past 2 years, it has been the most intense leadership moment, probably, I would say, of my lifetime. And I have a lot of life left, God willing. It's extremely difficult because the state did not step in to make decisions in the same way they did for municipalities. And as a result, school committees had to become not only thinking about their districts from an administrative perspective and how to pass a budget so the district can continue to move forward and think about equity issues. We had to become public health experts, which I am not, but I think I may want to add it to my resume after the past 2 years. And so it's been very difficult. I have so much respect for my colleague, Member Degraff, Vera-Degraff, because when I say we sat through very intense meetings, we sat through 6-hour meetings with the rawness of people's emotions, the fears, the hopes of having their children have the ability to get back in school. And on the other side of that, the intense fear of educators questioning whether or not it was the right thing to do. And we were sandwiched in the middle of these interests. And we had to dig deep down inside to figure out, okay, we have to take a step back and listen to all of these perspectives in a way that would then allow us to make informed, respectful decisions with safety in mind. And despite the challenges, despite the intensity of the moment, I'm actually really proud that we were able to make those decisions under probably I would say some of the most challenging of circumstances. So I have grown as a human being. I don't say that lightly. And it's one of the reasons why I'm taking a little break, because that was a lot of growth in a 2-year time period.
But those are important things for people to hear. And you make a very valid point. We don't pay enough attention to what happens on the school level. And I always think, if you want to talk about the future, you have to talk about schools. You have to talk about early education. You have to talk about families, the things that the city council doesn't have to as often have a conversation about. But you said what I wanted you to say, which was important, is that the state did not step in a way that would have made this all easier for whatever reason. And that's a whole nother program to talk about. Why did the state slowball this? Give you one message, then give you another message. It was terribly confusing. But it's important for people to know, and I'll help those that view this program will have a better understanding of how much came and goes into making these decisions that we hope are going to impact our community in a very good way for time to come. And I will guarantee you this, and it's something that I think Dr. Callahan said that made me think about it, about how parents get to these decisions and they're not there now, but you force them to do it. And the next thing you know, they say, and I always thought that was a good idea. You'll be so interested. It's so interesting how people's positions change when they're put in a place to have to do something that is actually, we believe in their best interest. But Member Degraff, I want to hear your thoughts about, because I know not only are you a young person, but you're a young person, opining on these life and death serious conversations at a young age. I'm proud and impressed that you put yourself in that position and do the work. And I'm glad that you represent so many other students that are doing it. But I would love for our audience to know and to hear what that's like for you.
Of course. Thank you for that. I think as a student member, me and my partner, Anais Killian, we have kind of a unique position on the school committee that none of the elected adult members have. We are elected too, we're just elected by the students. And so I think we don't have as much of the official powers that the adult members have. We cannot vote on motion, which is actually something that Vice Chair and me and Anais are working on. That'll be hopefully in the next couple of months, but we'll see how that turns out, having a student vote in some way. But for now, we can't vote. And so what we do as student members is really represent, right? And so we do our best to gather different perspectives from the students and from, mostly students in CRLS in the high school. And we bring them to these meetings. As Vice Chair Bowman mentioned, there's these 6-hour, really, really long meetings, and they're very intense. And stakeholders, people in public comment, the other adult members, the school committee members are all giving their perspectives. And all we can do, and the best we can do, is really just say our truth, right? And stick to what we believe is the best that should happen. And so this comes in the form of student reports. We try to give updates on what the student body is thinking, what they're doing at every school committee meeting throughout the pandemic. This was especially important during remote learning when everything was changing, when students were having such different adverse reactions to the schedule, to COVID rules, to going back in person. So that was one really big thing we did. And then aside from that, just asking questions, trying to be more informed, and really giving our perspective on student issues. There were many times when I believe, and Vice Chair Bowman, you can confirm this is right or not, I do believe we played I think it was valuable to have a student voice and to give kind of an insider perspective, if you will, on how students are reacting to this rule or this new implement. And so I'm actually looking forward to see how the mandate plays out in this way. And I'm sure in the school committee meeting in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we'll come back with new updates on this is how the students are reacting to this mandate, or this is how sports students are dealing with this. And so I think I'm really privileged to have this position on the school committee, and so I'm really excited that I'm able to share these perspectives. But I think more than anything, it's just sharing what's going on the ground level and making sure the adults in the system who are really making these decisions are fully informed on what the students believe and what they think and what they do.
Yeah, I just want to affirm it was invaluable, right? And not just your presence, the way both of the school committee members showed up. They showed up to the space prepared, right? They knew how to engage us through the systems and the function of the school committee to ensure their voices were heard, right? And one thing, and this is my bias or perspective, however people want to see it, when we were having these conversations, so often what is needed for students got lost a lot, and it became an adult-oriented conversation, which was really frustrating. But having the presence of our student school committee members help recalibrate that, so we can be reminded, oh no, we're doing this for students. Like literally all of us, elected leaders, the superintendent, principals, janitorial staff, everybody works on behalf of students that are children. And so really bringing their conversations through our student school committee members was just an invaluable part of the process. And I know it had impact on the decisions that we made. So I'm just so proud of them. I feel like a little mama bear after the past 2 years of being able to have them on the school committee and work with them, and really excited about both of our student school committee members' future. I know it's getting close to our time. The time just flies by when we have these conversations, Denise. It's so good. And I guess I want to close it out with one question. I know earlier I mentioned that I judged the pandemic based on my 20-month-old child. It makes me know like, oh, this is the month that we're in this pandemic. We're 20 months in this, and I'm just curious, how do we need to start thinking about the pandemic as we move forward? I know the term endemic has started to come up. Would love for Dr. Holmes to define what that means, and if we're anywhere near being able to actually use that as an official term when it comes to this pandemic, and just how all of us, I want to hear everyone's thoughts and opinions around how do we move forward based on the fact that we thought we would be in a different place, but here we are, and COVID is not under control. So how do we move forward as a community, particularly the Black community in mind, because this has disproportionately impacted us? So we can start with Dr. Holmes.
Sure. Thank you for that question. So the word endemic has two parts to its meaning. One part is that the disease is never going away. And the other part is that we've learned to live with it. Okay. I think public health officials, doctors, scientists are in agreement that the disease is never going away. So the question remains, have we learned to live with it? Now, there are still 80,000 cases a day and 1,000 deaths a day. And the question is, can we accept that? I think there are certain people, certain governors who've said, we're going to just accept that. We're just going to live with that. And that's in places in this country where, there's no masking and so forth. I think that's too many. That's 10 times what influenza is inflicting on our population. So I really think the allowing the vaccine for children was key. It's really key to moving the needle because it just brings that many more people vaccinated, brings us reducing the viral burden, as Dr. Callahan was saying. So getting our kids vaccinated, I think, is key, moving us to a place where we could begin to think about living with COVID the way we live with influenza.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, those numbers are unacceptable, unacceptable and unnecessary. That's the other thing, unnecessary. And, if we look at the Spanish flu, what, 1918, it was, this is before we had the vaccine, so we could do anything with the flu. Folks were masked. You can see the pictures. They certainly were physically distanced. You see the wards with folks lined up being cared for, and, it took about, I think, roughly 5 years to get that situation under control. But here we are 100 years later, we've still got the flu. So the family has not left the planet, okay? COVID, the coronavirus is the family, they're not leaving the planet. We're going to have to deal with COVID, some variant of COVID-19, just like we are still dealing with variants of the flu. And we want to understand that there are things that we can do to reduce the viral load. There's things that we can, hopefully treatment, will be advancing as well, that we'll be able to have some treatment for viruses. Viruses are very resistant to treatment. Their job is to multiply, and that is what they do best. And that's what they want to do in the host. Vaccination reduces the likelihood that the vaccine will reproduce in the host. And the more reproduction, the more the variant. So there's a lot of ways that vaccination can help us get to the point of being not only, understanding that it's not going anywhere, but also being able to live with it. It also means that we have to start thinking outside of the silos of medicine and health and really look at all of the interdisciplinary nature of life. I founded a nonprofit called the Wellness Collaborative, and that is one of the things that we are emphasizing is that health and well-being is more than just one little silo. It's more than housing. It's more than food security. It's a whole host of things that have to be coordinated. And our policies do not reflect that. Our policies in general don't enable a person to stay home if they're sick. Not really. I mean, they're penalized if their child is sick to be able to stay home to reduce the spread. I mean, this is not new. We have not designed a lifestyle, a society that is conducive to moving things from pandemic to endemic. We really don't. We have to fight for that. And we have to fight for a number of levels. I'm so delighted that the students are in the council meetings, that their voices are being heard, because there are a lot of changes that we need to see happen. I digress a little, but I think it's important to understand that it's bigger than just getting this vaccine in order, especially when it comes to the disparities that are across the board for well-being of the Black community. And we need to see them as all connected and begin to work and to fight for what is just and what is right. So I think that we are heading in the right direction. We certainly are heading in the right direction. We are still in the pandemic. Endemic is a wonderful place to go. That's a journey, and we're going towards it, but we're not there yet. And we have to, my biggest fear is that we get the vaccines to 5 to 11-year-olds and people begin to really think that we're done with the pandemic, take off the mask and not take the regular precautions that we need to have, take them seriously. We need to continue to take them seriously and continue to fight for what's right for for the least of these, for all of the members of our society.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, I guess, continue Dr. Callahan's thoughts. I think as we move forward into an endemic phase, I think the biggest thing, or one of the largest things, is this kind of education and information, just being on the same page for everybody across the community. And so I think having things like this Black Cambridge panel and talking with Drs. Holmes and Dr. Callahan is really one of the best things we can be doing, elevating Black voices and having these conversations and making sure we can transmit information in the best and clearest and most honest way possible is the best thing we can do in any kind of pandemic, in any kind of social issue, but especially COVID. So I'm very excited to have been a part of this panel, but I think this is one of the best things we can do.
I have to talk about excitement. I'm very excited. I'm excited to have this opportunity to have each of you here. It really does make me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that this conversation is just one of many that will continue. I'm hopeful because each of you are standing in the gap and giving your information and speaking your truth and holding this illness and all the other illnesses that make it so pervasive, sort of holding it back. I am truly hopeful that as we even air this program and keep people get informed and stay informed, that we will do what you spoke to, Dr. Callahan, focus on health and well-being. And then I'm always grateful to have my co-host that keeps us in good trouble all the time to make sure that we are informing our community on a regular and ongoing basis about what's going on in our community and how we can all be safe, healthy, and informed. Manikka?
Yes, I'm elated. Like every time we do one of these, Denise, I feel inspired because so often whenever we talk about the challenges of our community, sometimes we don't see the beauty in the challenge, right? And I feel like Black Cambridge and the way in which, Denise, we put these together, it's both and, right? We can talk about the challenges, but man, the guests that we bring on this show is the beauty, right? And I feel more empowered. I feel like I'm in great company every time we do this. So thank you so much to member Vera-Degraff, which we're going to follow up and we're going to do another program with each other. So stay tuned. We're going to engage students on the ground at the high school that's dealing with some of these issues. I'm really grateful for Dr. Holmes, she is a leader in her field in epidemiology and in this community and has given so much to the Cambridge public school system. So thank you. And Dr. Callahan, I know how beloved you are. Like some of your patients, their parents live in my neighborhood and they just speak so highly of you. So thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank CCTV. Thank you for valuing this program and working in partnership with Denise and my colleague, for the next 40 days, right, Denise?
No, you may not be in elected office.
Yes.
You certainly be in selected office.
Yes, we'll go with that. And so, but this is one way that I'm not leaving, like I'm leaving an official title, but my commitment to the community goes way beyond the title. So I'm really excited to engage and participate in a different way moving forward. So we're really excited. Black Cambridge is back, right, Denise?
Back and bad.
Yes. So stay tuned, everyone, and thank you again for being a part of today's program.
And thanks to our viewing audience. So stay tuned. We have more for you in the upcoming weeks and months.